I think it's changed my life, Simon. I sort of feel like in forcing myself to think about the future, I sort of suddenly saw a lot more clearly a sort of path to that future if I want that future and not the other future, which is not what I want, really. I don't like the way things are going. It's pretty scary and uncomfortable, and it can be really depressing. So I sort of felt like when I started the whole thing and it went towards that, I just thought, you know what, I don't want this. And I've never wanted that. And I've been fighting against it, for 50 years.
My name is Simon Waller, and this is the Future with Friends podcast, a show where I make zero attempt to try and predict the future, even though I'm a trained futurist, and instead I enlist my friends to do it for me. Thankfully, I have some very smart and insightful friends. Some of them are best-selling authors. Most will be considered leading thinkers in their field of expertise. I guarantee that every single one of them will have compelling and unique insights to share about what might happen next. Each episode, I invite a friend onto the show to explore the future of anything that they would like. I then task them to go away and create a short scenario about that future set at least 5 years from now, something that captures their hopes and dreams or maybe their fears and concerns. And then over the course of the show, we dissect that scenario. We start to think about the critical uncertainties, the alternate possibilities, and the decisions that we can make today to create the future that we want tomorrow. Welcome to The Future with Friends.
Hello and welcome back for season 2 of The Future with Friends. Today I'm being joined by my friend Kath. Kath, I've known for over a decade, and in fact, she was the editor of my first book, Analogosaurus. Kath's background is a journalist, storytelling expert, but then Kath is also recently retired. And I must admit that when I reached out to Kath, I had thought that this might be the topic that we talked about. And even though it's really important for me that the guest gets to choose the topic themselves, I kind of had an inkling that it might actually be something that Kath would be interested in exploring with me. And in fact, when we had our first conversation, that's exactly how it went down. The interesting part of it was, though, that when Kath came back to me with her scenario, it seemed to be less about retirement and more about protest. We talked about it a bit further, and she decided that she was going to pivot and change the topic that she wanted to explore. And today we will be talking about the future of protest. This is such an insightful conversation, and it actually shared a lot about Kath, the stories I hadn't known about her own youth and her own involvement in the 1970s and 80s around different protest movements. And it's actually a result of the scenario and the podcast has actually reinvigorated her to be involved in this type of work again. It's a really interesting conversation, but also one that shows how this type of work and even just a very podcast recording can have real world impact. I'm going to throw it over now to the conversation with Kath. I hope you enjoy it, and welcome back to The Future with Friends. Hello and welcome to The Future with Friends. Today I'm being joined by a friend of mine I met over a decade ago, Kath Walters. Kath and I don't even, do you remember when we first met? What was your memory of our first meeting, Kath?
My memory, I think I might have seen you in the Thought Leader Business School kind of immersions, but my memory is actually of us having a coffee and you sort of saying, look, I want you to help me with my book. And I was kind of like a bit sort of unsure about what this was all about. So, and then you were sort of saying, I was like, oh, okay. And you were saying, eventually you said, and in exchange, I'll give you some technology advice. So I wasn't quite sure of the terms of the contract initially. It was just down the back of somewhere.
Well, so my memory was that we did do an exchange. There was a contra deal that was done. And at the time, I remember being a little bit intimidated by you.
Oh.
So Kath, you were a journalist, correct? Where did you work when you as a journalist? Like, it was pretty like high level journalism. It wasn't just kind of like the local paper.
No, I worked for Fairfax. I worked in a weekly business publication that was called Business Review Weekly, or BRW. Now, like many publications, kind of defunct. It was a big thing. Was started by Robert Godlebson, who was a fabulous journalist who started to bring in the sort of stories of the people behind the companies in Australia, and it was a really fun time. I loved it.
Yeah. I just remember, like, I don't know, like there's something about someone perhaps who's been a journalist. Like, you're quite, like, not a little bit direct, like you want to get to the fact or the story. And I felt at the time I was still kind of playing as a keynote speaker or playing as an author. And then I met you and you were like, oh, but like, this is someone who actually has and does a job, like, and I do remember we did at the time I was doing some tech coaching stuff and we did a contra deal. I think it was actually initially around some public relations work or something like that. But then I think through that, we developed a relationship that led to also my first book, Analogosaurus, and your advice and stuff on that. But yeah, I reckon it goes back. And I think we're also both working out the hub at the time. Was that right?
It was at the hub, wasn't it? I keep sort of trying to remember. I kind of can picture the coffee shop, but I can't picture exactly where in the city it was.
Yeah.
But I was at the hub at that stage,
Yeah. So I started the hub when I first came over here in 2020. So I reckon we might have even seen each other around the hub and then ended up in business school. But this is all validating the fact that this is a genuine friendship. We've known each other a long time. There's not a random person I picked up off the street. You are very glad to have you on The Future with Friends.
Beautiful, yes. No, and I've just got to say, like, a lot of that stuff that tech stuff you taught me in that very first exchange, I still use today all the time.
Well, this is the thing that really, I mean, I imagine for like a lot of the people I worked with back then, there was a lack of confidence perhaps around technology that made them go, yeah, I could actually do with some help here. And then when we reconnected and we started talking about you coming on the podcast, you blew my mind because apparently was it last year, you were one of the 3% or 5% top users of ChatGPT in the world?
It was a bit of a sobering moment when ChatGPT said, oh, here's a review of your 2025 use of, and it said, oh, you're in the top 3% of users in the world. I'm like, I can believe that. Like, I can believe that, but it was also a shock. I'm like, oh, do I need to sort of stop that? Anyway, it was just something I found the introduction of AI both very confronting and very fascinating. I asked Chat, I said, well, why do you think I'm in the top 3%? And it said, because you ask a lot of questions. And so this is true. Like, when I get an answer from ChatGPT, I will interrogate that answer a lot.
Yeah. And so I must admit, when you first shared that little factoid with me, I was like, Kath, really? And not like, and part of it was because I know of your journalistic roots, right? Like, and the concern around things like artificial intelligence is the reliability of it and the efficacy of it. And in some ways, your use of it like that, and even what you just explained then, that when you get served up a response, you cannot accept it at face value and you feel a need to deeply interrogate it. And having been on the other side of that, not necessarily an interrogation, but that level of inquiry, right? I was like, okay, yeah, that is probably the way it makes sense. And in a way, there's a credibility it gave me, like around the use of, because I use ChatGPT probably in a similar way. I struggle to accept face value. And almost like I want to see the references. I want to go to those references. I want to read those. I want to get the counterpoint. And only then can we arrive at something that feels like something I can trust. Yeah.
Yeah. And often, I mean, early on in the process, I would often just ask it to argue with itself. Because why do I need to do the work? I just say, well, okay, well, now give me the opposite point of view. And so, I would say argue with yourself, and it would then provide the other argument, and then we go from there. I kind of rarely use it to get facts. I was more using it to sort of explore perspectives, explore ideas. Yeah, I would, but early on, I clicked through the links. Like the first thing I did was click the links, and it was like, oh, no such place. So
Yeah. And so when we kind of started talking about, you come on the podcast and we're exploring different topics, you came up with something that I thought was super interesting and exciting, because you have recently retired. And
retired from paid work, yes.
retired from paid work, exactly, right? And I was like, oh, wow. And we talked about this concept of the future of retirement. And I was like, this is such an interesting topic, because I've had my own views around, having seen parents retire, or my dad almost like pretend to retire. And then I actually think he retired for the first time when he was in his 40s, then found out there was no one else retired his age, got sick of playing golf with like people, 30 years older than him, and then got back and went and got another job, like I bought another business. And the second time around, almost like didn't retire, like he just still has his little finger in the fishing business somewhere. But I was like, oh, this is such a great thing to explore. And then you sent me your first, we talked about it. You sent me a draft of your scenario. And I was like, hang on, Kath, this is not about the future of retirement. And we've now had to pivot. Is that right?
Correct. Because the coming up with the scenario took me into a place that I had to explore. I didn't, if it was now, I could tell you about now, but we're talking about the future. Excuse me. And I looked at the future and I thought, well, and I was doing some prompts that you'd given me and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, I don't want that future. I don't want to write that future, because that future is, we lose everything. I didn't want to go there. And it created a sudden insight for me, because I'm writing a novel about the stories we tell. And so I sort of then kind of started looking at telling a different story. And again, I was going back to the robot as I was thinking through the ideas. That's the robot I call the AI. And saying, well, what if it wasn't like that? What if we did something different? What if it didn't end up that way? What if AI didn't collapse the world? What if that didn't work out that way? What would we as human beings have had to have done to change that?
Mm.
And I found that much more interesting. And it sparked a sort of a resurgence in me of both hope and a sense of my sort of duty as a person no longer in paid work to get out in the streets and protest.
Yeah. So this is so interesting, and we'll talk after we hear your scenario. We'll talk a little bit more about the process that you went through to write it. But I do think there's something very interesting about the process, in the sense that I think when we had those conversations beforehand, we talked a little bit about like, okay, here's some prompts, and they're both cognitive prompts, but also prompts you can use with things like a large language model like ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Here's a set of prompts to take you through and think a little bit deeper about the future.
Yeah.
And then one of the things I think I shared with you, and I've said this to most guests, is like, at the end of the day, like your scenario is going to be about 5 minutes, which is about a page and a half or so. And you're going to find that there's only one thing you can explore well in that. And part of this process is you working out what's that one thing. What do you care about so much that when you're forced into this difficult situation, this is what you would choose? And as I said, what was super interesting for me is that I got the scenario. I was like, oh, this isn't actually about retirement at all. The only reference to retirement in it is that you're retired. And and what it actually, when we kind of went through that the first time, and we realized, this is actually about the future of protest.
Yes.
And that again is such an interesting topic. And so As much as I'm like, oh, I'm so keen to explore the future of retirement with you at some point, I'm very, very happy we're doing this version today.
Well, that is, I mean, it is retirement because I see my one of the key jobs of my retirement is to reboot people's capacity to believe in the power of protest.
Okay. So let's now have a listen to your scenario. So in a sec, I'm going to throw the microphone to you. Well, you've actually already got one, so I won't have to throw it. But I'm going to throw the microphone to you, and I'm going to let you to read your scenario from the start to finish. Before we do, one last thing. So the other requirement I give you in this is you must choose a point in time. It has to be at least 5 years in the future, and you have chosen 5 years into the future.
Yes, I pushed it out a little bit.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Pushed it out to 2035.
Oh, 2035. Okay, cool. And is there any significance or rationale behind the time frame?
I was looking at what I had thought had happened in the interval between my scenario and now, and I thought we needed a little bit more for that to have happened.
Yeah, and there's a tension, isn't there, between if we come too close, we can't imagine difference. But almost like if we take too far out, it feels maybe even a sense like a little bit out of our control. Whereas I feel like with this time frame is we can see the logic that we can go through and we can see how people would be empowered for that action. So, okay, no more from me, Kath. We're now going to throw to you. Please tell us about the future of protest.
Okay, I'm reading from my iPad. So the future of protest 2035. I was a little nervous about taking off my clothes, but everybody else was naked. I was 18 at the Cotter River in 1976, just outside Canberra. It was hot, even under the shade of the casuarina trees. I wandered with everyone amongst the stalls of the first down-to-earth Confest. We discussed environmentalism, self-expression and community living. We felt full of hope and conviction. We believed we could make the world better just by talking with each other, and we did. There was a long list of victories, but they got lost. They got buried. We got a long way, and then we lost heart. So how did we regain it? So it's March now, 2035, and the streets are ringing again in the Rocks in Sydney. I'm standing with my daughter, who's now 42, amongst 500,000 people. Climate action. We are not moving until all the world's governments sign the agreement. As the afternoon light turns the city buildings honey gold, there's no anger, no panic. We're singing Into My Arms by Nick Cave, the melody rising up the canyons of sandstone. It's not a song about climate, it's about love. My daughter squeezes my hand. She grew up in a time of severe climate anxiety, and so did her generation. They were told to grieve the inevitable. Instead, they're here singing, dancing, believing in a future worth fighting for. It was the Santos mining fracking travesty that broke our country. It broke the world. It wasn't the mining giant Rio Tinto deliberately destroying two 46,000-year-old rock shelters in Jukan Gorge in Western Australia to expand their iron ore mine. It wasn't the Japaluka mine's uranium tailings dam leaching across swathes of Arnhem Land. Though we wept and we marched, we lost those fights. The world's governments did not stop. The heat, the fires, the storms and the avalanches rained down across the earth. It was the destruction of a pristine hot spring deep in remote Northern Territory that left us gasping. A fracking project that contaminated the springs and spread for hundreds of kilometres. All that fossil fuel, gas, the planet could not afford to burn. We marched with a kind of despairing fury that saw us win and the mine closed. But the change had begun earlier. It began when the artists, movie makers and authors woke up. We had become the enemy of the future, bombarding the world with conspiracy stories and images of burning temperatures, collapsed technology and people responding with cruelty to diminishing resources. We played into the hands of the rich and the powerful. We told their stories of inevitable collapse. Instead of inspiring change, Our creative visions destroyed hope and increased a fatalistic despair, and the rich raked in their riches. Before the hot spring died, we had begun to remember our power. Slowly, new books and movies and paintings emerged, showing a world protected, a population ignited, damage averted and losses reversed. We wrote stories about a future where change became reality, the end of dystopia. Yes, hard won, hard fought, but a new future where the planet thrived. Many of those singing and marching today are grey-haired. The protesters from the 70s and the 80s, like me, are back. We helped tell the stories of successful projects, saving the saving the Franklin River, winning the right for women to vote, and striking for Indigenous stockmen to be paid. We learned the art of defiance the way Bob Brown wrote about it. When we regained hope, we regained agency. In small groups, we learned to organise the food, the toilets, the medical care, the protection from the weather. We can stay here for as long as it takes. We continue our songs and the police stand at a distance, uncertain. Can you arrest people for singing and dancing on the street? How would it look on the Sydney Morning Herald front page? The sun's lower. From the homes around us, people open their windows, lean out and join our song. Babies on their hips, toddlers pointing. I think of 1976, all that naked hope and conviction at the Cotter River. And I think we were right. It just took 55 years to get here. It took reading, it took learning, it took the creative class to remember they had the power to move people. Beyond these buildings, the sun glints on the harbour and sinks. Candles, phones, we're all still singing and the city is singing with us.
That's so beautifully written. Obviously, it helps when you invite a journalist onto the show.
Thank you.
I mean, I love the other thing I really love when guests come on, and especially when I read something like this, is the personalness of it. And yours incredibly so. Like, I think the reference to your own experience, in protest movements in the 70s.
Yep.
And I think it sets up the whole scenario really beautifully, and there's a beautiful symmetry and symbolism in it. But it also kind of raises questions, which we'll explore in a little bit, about almost like this missing middle. Like almost we were really good at protesting and then we got really bad at it. And now it feels like it's in this very much a resurgence phase.
Yeah.
So I'll park that for a second. I just want to talk a little bit before we do about the process of writing this, and specifically as someone who's a journalist, and as we talked beforehand, you have a desire to have a level of deeper truth in what you do, right? In what you write. You're going to accept things at face value. How do you take that when you're talking about a scenario of the future? Like when you talk about a scenario of the future, there is no fact yet.
Yes.
Can you talk me through about what the experience was like for you and how you kind of went about it?
I had to do a lot of fact checking. I had to check what the confess was. That was a long time ago. I had to go back and check those facts. I had to draw on an incident literally heard in the news yesterday about this fracking project that's going to sort of contaminate the water basin in this really remote, beautiful springs area in Northern Territory. I thought, wow, that's a heartbreaking story. This little spring that has kind of escaped. It's escaped the sort of notice of the world, which kind of causes complete destruction of so many things. And then, it's underneath there is a whole lot of gas we can't afford to burn on this planet, and they want to go and do that fracking process, which is really about getting in the water table in the desert we're talking about. Yeah, craziness. And I just thought, wow, what a great example. Like, you would think that the Rio Tinto blowing up the sacred sites was enough, yeah? You would think, really, the Jabiluka mine, which was in the 80s and 90s, the tailings dams was enough. But I think there was a big effort, but it's got to be a huge effort. I think the reason why we're still struggling to come to agreement in terms of global warming, even though it's like so patently obvious and everybody wants it, except the certain sort of government levels, is because of the politics of it. Not enough people are on the streets. That's the sort of thing. Like we need the political will. We need people to say, hell yeah, and just for people, and we need to say we're not moving until you move.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the lines I picked up in it about that idea of we can stay. What did you say? You said the line, we can stay here for as long as it takes.
Yeah.
And again, as one of the things I highlighted, 'cause I wanted to talk to you about it. I kind of wondered about the conditions whereby that becomes the truth. So when we kind of go through this process, and I think even in one of the conversations we had, I think initially you painted this kind of ideal of where you think we could get to. And you're
Yes.
very intent on this. Like, I don't want this to be a dystopian scenario. I want this to be something that is filled with hope. And almost I could sense there was like almost like a bit of a frustration and potentially even a little bit of anger that, and this kind of comes into it, the creative class that keeps pushing this dystopian narrative. Let's not do that. Let's actually push something that's really positive. And so, but when I asked you to do that, I was like, okay, but talk me through the logic of how do we get from here to a point where there is a shift in that consciousness and we get to a point where 500,000 people are protesting on a street in Sydney?
Beautiful.
Can you,
Well,
talk me through what you had to come to terms with in terms of that, logic and that shift?
Well, two things. One is interesting, after writing the first scenario, which was kind of a bit global and we sort of narrowed it down, a friend of mine said, I'm going to an activist workshop on Sunday. And I'm like, great, I'm coming. Because I'd just written the scenario and I just realized that if I wanted that scenario to happen, I better start getting my sort of skills back up. And I went to that particular workshop. It was in Castlemaine, and it was amazing. It was incredible. I thought, wow. For one thing, I thought, oh, look at these young people doing it. Like they were doing it. They were spending their lives on this. They were sharing the knowledge. They were using a Bob Brown Foundation nonviolent direct action sort of package, as it were. It was so sophisticated compared to really what we were doing when we were wandering around on the Cotter River. Thinking the talking was enough, and it was. It was, so much has changed that people don't even know. Like you have to have been in the 1970s when you walked into a sandwich shop and you got 2 pieces of tip-top white bread with a Kraft cheddar sort of pre-sliced thing between it. A sophisticated version of a sandwich had lettuce on it. And all of that stuff has changed because of the sort of health movement, the thing that we were kind of about healthy eating, all that stuff. Anyway, that all changed. But this reminded me, this little workshop, there were 20 people or so there, reminded me of the 70s, where we would have what we called, especially in the feminist movement, we had consciousness raising groups. And we'd get together in small groups and we'd talk about politics of sexism and patriarchy. And it was a place where people could talk in a sort of an unthreatened kind of environment and say, but, I have to go now because I've got to make the dinner. And we'd be like, nope, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't need to make the dinner tonight. Maybe you could say you were at a consciousness raising meeting and you didn't get time for the dinner. So we educated each other. And this, I think, is the story of it. And so when I went to this little meeting, and I thought, these people are doing this all over the place, I saw fantastic. And one of the things that was mentioned was how we don't write this, the history of protest and its successes is always written out of history.
Mm.
You know, we have the vote, and Australia was the first place in the world to give women the vote. We have the vote because suffragettes in England, they walked the streets against their sort of husband's permission. They were arrested. They were put in prison. They went on a hunger strike as a result, and they were force-fed. I mean, it is, you know, that's why I can vote. The thing I reckon I realised is it doesn't stop. It just doesn't stop. I think there was a point where we got to like, okay, when do we stop? When do we kind of like think that we've done it? And then I just realised recently it doesn't stop. And I think that those middle years where we lost it, it's normal. You've got little kids and you're kind of trying to get things secure, and like, that's cool. The grey-haired people can get out, the students maybe can get out. We had free education, you know, like we had free education. Where did that go? You know, that's a terrible loss. But we had, you know, young students, we had, and the sort of grey hairs or the elders of our community. We can do it while you got kids, and, you know, you just can't get on the streets. It's too busy.
Yeah, but I do wonder, like, so yeah, I'm born a generation after you. So just after you were pranced around naked at the Cotter River in 77, I was born, right? So in theory, though, as you were like moving into those years, as I said, having young kids, and it should have been my generation that picked it up. And I actually wonder whether it was my generation that dropped the ball. Like, you know, like, and I don't know whether it's true or not true, because I've been trying to make sense of it myself. Like, I've never been to a protest.
Oh, such fun.
This is what I took out of it. Like, shit, I'm missing out entirely here. This looks like...
You are.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that this is the thing I wanted to reanimate or re-energize, is we just had a ball. We had a ball. There we were at the Cotter River. We were all running around. For some reason, I think the self-expression was the nakedness. I don't know what that was about. But anyway, we were all sort of trying to do something different. But we were having a great time.
So this,
And
yeah.
this, I think Bob Brown talked about this on a recent interview about his new book, Defiance, which is, I can't wait to read. We were having a great time. We were organising things. It's an incredible sense of when you do some kind of action, you feel this huge sense of hope, agency, connection, connecting with these 20 people I'm like never met before. Beautiful. It's fun.
So yeah, I feel after having read this scenario that I've been missing out is the first thing. The kind of thing I picked up around like the way and I tried to understand and did some research myself around, because you reference like how like in the 60s and 70s, nudity was actually used for its shock value. It's like we will bring attention to this thing because of it. Yeah. And if we get in the news, then more people will be aware of the thing that we are protesting about.
Yeah.
But now it's kind of like, well, you know, I think there's like the World Naked Bike Ride, which has now been running for nearly 18 years or 20 years or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
So one of the things when you look at like the goals of the bike ride, it feels like they've shifted over time. And even like in the US, it's been used recently in Portland as almost like an anti-ice thing. But then it's also been used around kind of climate and transportation and like, but almost at some point, I wonder like whether it's lost its shock value. And it's now just people who like to get naked out on bikes, right? Like as an example.
Which is fine.
Which is also fine, right? But more the point, like, so like, what is it that we have to create shock value? Like, or is that even necessary? Like, we can create shock. Like in this case where you talk about 500,000 people turn up for a protest. You know, I remember the images of the pro-Palestinian protests in Sydney and people marching across the Harbour Bridge, and just the sheer scale of it is shocking. Like, and I don't say shocking isn't shocking bad. It's like it has that impact, right?
Yeah,
it has impact.
It does.
But I kind of go like, oh, what have we got left? Like in a positive sense, like because there's a positiveness to getting naked, right? Like it's It's like it's disarming. It's like I'm not hiding anything. I'm not concealing a weapon. There's nothing here. Like Whereas
I'm vulnerable here. I'm vulnerable.
correct.
So
Whereas I
if the
feel
police come and arrest me,
increasingly,
I'm vulnerable.
but the shock stuff is coming. We're throwing paint at art in the Louvre and going like, that's shock, right? If we tried to face this thing, like, what do you think we've got left? Like, what does positive shock and positive attention look like in the future of protest?
It looks like singing and dancing, maybe. I mean, this was one of the points that they made in the activism workshop, which is why I put that thing in about us singing it, because they mentioned you've got to create a dilemma for the authorities. Like, can we really, like, if we kind of go with our kind of leather jackets and our big signs and our shouting and our things like that, there's a sort of a collective sense from the society that you should put those people in jail. But if we're a bunch of people out dancing, is the police face a dilemma. Like, what are we doing arresting dancing people or naked people or whatever it is? Do you remember the protest of the grandmothers knitting in, I think, look, this is terrible because I can't remember whether it was Argentina or Chile, but there was the disappeared, they kept the dictating regime.
Oh, yeah, with all the people had gone missing. Yeah.
Disappeared, just gone. And the grandmothers sat on chairs knitting. I mean, it was a brilliant, brilliant stroke of shock, because when you come and arrest a bunch of knitting grandmothers, you look like the oppressor you are. So we have to keep inventing those things. We just have to keep inventing them. I can't ever tell if Instagram is real or not. Like, I just have no idea if I'm looking at AI generated. But if it's true, the people in Times Square protesting what's going on in America at all sorts of levels are singing. They're out there singing together. And it's this, just watching it, if it's true, is a sort of even if it's not true, actually, just watching it is kind of like, yeah, that's kind of where we need to be. This sense that we, sort of are part of a bigger thing, that we're not just kind of going to lie down and get trampled over, even at the sort of height of that happening in the world right now by, yes, the politicians, but also the tech bros. I mean, the tech bros are just running rampant.
Well, I picked up on that as well, by the way, around the singing and the dancing and stuff. And what it reminded for me, I was thinking one of the signals that I picked up recently, which is very closely aligned at the ICE protests in the US. I think it started, I think, in Portland, was the people dressing up in inflatable suits. And It started with one guy as an inflatable turtle. But there's now actually a whole not-for-profit in the US called Operation Inflation.
Right.
And the idea with Operation Inflation is you can donate an inflatable suit. Right. And there's someone just rocks up with a truck full of inflatable suits to protest sites, and you can just again, it's that same idea as like how threatening am I if I'm a massive inflatable dinosaur?
Exactly.
And then to your point about that question about, well, what do we do? There was actually a video recorded of an ICE agent spraying pepper spray into the air intake valve of someone's suit.
Ooh.
Which was just but it got say 2.5 or 3 million views on socials and stuff, because that was shocking. Yeah. It was shocking because you would do that to someone where there's this kind of is entirely non-threatening. We're allowed to be here. Even in the US, the right to protest is more enshrined in law than it is in Australia. Yeah. So I picked up that as well. And I kind of I imagine in this future of yours, there's a lot of inflatable suits, or there's jugglers and people on unicycles, and there's actually almost this very festive experience.
Yes. And that's how it was.
Yeah.
I remember once walking along down kind of, what's it called? Canberra Avenue, or Northbourne Avenue in Canberra. And I was sort of walking along with this guy who I later ended up in a commune with, Patrick. And there was a policeman walking alongside, sort of keeping the crowd on a sort of And my friend Patrick turned around and he said, "Oh, glad you could make it." like to the policeman, as if he was walking along in the protest with it. And it was just the end of, and the guy couldn't help smiling, I mean, like it was just this kind of thing where we just didn't do a violent sort of approach. And I loved like the level of sophistication around consensus and consent and non-violence in the workshop that I attended. And so I advise everyone to go to one, Bob Brown Foundation. It's just so sophisticated now compared to how we sort of started. And you've got to remember, like the ad for the Confest was in the classified section of the Canberra Times. I mean, it was like down a little square. I looked it up. It was so fascinating. This is the fact-checking stuff. It was so fascinating to look and like, wow, that's how we found about it. All like sort of handouts, and they were always written in this kind of really handwritten writing, What did Confest even mean? I think it was a sort of a kind of a
conservation festival.
Maybe could have been, or it could have been convention and festival, but it was about a festival.
Yeah.
So I wanted to reboot people's sense that this, like, we're not going to get there. We're going to just have fun, always keeping them back.
Yeah.
Like journalism is holding a power to account. So I spend my time, and look, I was in the union movement, and I, was out there and I protested about Iraq and all of those things. But, I was very consumed with work and my daughter and everything like that. But, it's essentially, journalists don't have any real qualifications. I mean, you can get a communications degree. I didn't. It's about journalists are people who record the daily activities, journal, and hold power to account. And we learn it from each other, how to do it, how to not get intimidated. And like people really try to intimidate you. They ring you up and say, if you print that, I'm going to sue the blah, 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 out of Fairfax. And, like they do that.
Yeah.
So we have to sort of, but it needs to be sophisticated. Like if we were going to actually have 500,000 people in the streets of Sydney, we would have to have all of those streets on board, feeding, allowing people to go in and sort of go to the toilet or have a shower, or we'd have to have rows and rows of. So you have to get it to that level, everybody has to have kind of learned some skills around organisation.
That's what I took in there. There was a level of sophistication around this that is greater than I imagined it would be. Maybe it's greater than it is right now. But I also feel there's something like, I love this, that just the premise. We have some pretty experienced protesters here who are now bringing a new generation on board. And there is this kind of melting pot of kind of the old and the new in a way, but underpinned by almost like, the kind of the free love vibe, or that kind of positive love vibe of the 60s and 70s. And I feel like that's almost a bit that's missing. And one thing that definitely came up for me in this is like, okay, so you've chosen that we're protesting about in like the environment. Right? And I go, of all the things that you see people protesting about, that one is, I would suggest, the least controversial.
Yes, that's true.
You don't get a lot of counter protesters to environmental protests.
No.
Right. But let's talk about some of the other stuff around kind of immigration, anti-immigration type stuff, where there's much more likely to have a sense of conflict.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this plays out in the same way? Or do you think like, if that at the moment, again, and you kind of talk about things like the pro-Palestinian rallies and stuff, and it being largely the motivators around that has been, some of the atrocities that have been seen in places like Gaza. Right?
Indeed.
How do you dress up in inflatable suits for that? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there something that has so much gravitas that it's really hard to hold the line on love, if that may, you know what I mean?
Yeah, really good question. I think you do have to sort of strategize for the actual, for the topic. And I think that the pro-Palestinian protests have been very sophisticated in doing that, because one thing that they've been very, very committed to is making sure they're peaceful. I mean, they are protesting against war, and I know that they get characterized as having, violence or something. They just haven't. It's just not true. There have been violence, people sort of protesting against them, but they have been very conscious that if they're protesting war, they need to project peace. And so I think those are the sort of nuances. Like, actions do have to have a strategy and thought behind them. They have to, there are people who plan these things, and I've never really been one of them. I'm a turner-upper. But I hope that'll change. I hope that I will be one of the people who plans them. But because I might be getting a bit vulnerable to be out turning up on some of them, like I can't, I'm not as strong and agile as I once was to sort of jump.
The real question is, can you knit?
That's good. Yeah, if I can, as long as I can knit, no, I can't, but I can pretend to knit. So you have to strategize appropriate to the topic, and you're absolutely right. It would, and look, I don't think those protests are fun in that sense of what we were talking about, but they do create a sense of community, collegiality, hope, conviction, a sense that, you're just not alone, feeling completely disempowered. Yeah, I mean, they are remarkably, galvanizing. They galvanize people's sense that they are not victims of a world where technology and sort of brute strength always win. And, I get it. We're really fighting hard at the moment. I get it. So, but they work,
Well,
they really work.
It has been super interesting when you look at some of the stats around participation in protesting. It's been growing I think it's something like about 10% year on year for the last decade. And when you kind of look at some of the reasons behind that, and again, I couldn't find a lot of data that was specific to Australia, but there's been some global studies that have been done. And we aren't peak protesters in Australia, and not even the US. It's actually places around kind of North Africa and the Middle East are actually, and again, it's like they're often protesting against quite high levels of oppression, etc. And that really drives people to the street and to face like high levels of kind of, brutality as a result. But even like as a global movement, protesting has grown for the last decade, which I found super interesting. And I think part of that, if we go, what are the underlying reasons for it, is one thing that came up as this data was that, so with younger generations, they have less faith in government, which means that in countries where voting isn't compulsory, they're actually less likely to vote, but more likely to protest. So they don't necessarily feel that voting is going to change things.
See, that's where I feel like, sorry.
Yeah, go. No, but by protesting and involved in that and showing a movement and a solidarity with others, that is actually how they're more likely to make a shift in government policy or position. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I feel like the creatives have sort of played into an incorrect narrative. I mean, one of the reasons that people believe that governments are corrupt, and I'm not saying the governments are never corrupt, but one of the reasons people think they're rotten to the core is because of all the movies around it. Like, yes, okay, we had what was his name? Anyway, we have had incidences of corruption, terrible corruption. But the reality is that, in Australia, in America even, a lot of very dedicated people who are committed to the sort of serving of the public against being paid stupid wages in corporate sort of blah, blah, they are serving the people. And I think we have that in Australia. We have an incredible number of politicians who walk a horrible line between pissing me off and making someone else happy, you know, doing sort of public service. And I think that, you know, I remember having a sort of a bit of a stand-up Barney in my younger days when I was much more sort of insensitive with a friend of mine who said she never voted. And I'm like, the women went on the streets and they were force-fed and thrown in prison for you to vote. Get out and vote, like we have to use all our mechanisms. I think that idea that it's pointless voting, it's a neoliberalist, conservatist, the people who vote, they want to be the peers. They want to be the lords and the ladies. We want to get out there and we want to vote because that's one thing we can do. And then we can lobby our politicians too. And we can, go in and ask them questions that they have to ask in Parliament. And apparently, I discovered recently, still going, still so much to learn, There's still so much to learn about how the system works and how we kind of engage with it and belief that we can do it and we can change things and that they do care. They really care. When you get out on the street, they know that there's 10 people sitting at home for every one of you. And
maybe that's what it is. And again, I'm trying to understand that. Why is it that there is obviously a younger generation or even a general movement? I mean, trust in government has fallen and all formal institutions has fallen significantly over the last decade or so. I think some of it driven by the pandemic and people questioning the response to that. Some are driven by, social media and the echo chambers. But I do think there's something also to be said for when I vote, I don't know who else here feels like I do. But if I go to a protest, I'm fairly comfortable that all these people feel like I do when I look around. Yeah. And there's a solidarity and a sense of belonging that we're also craving. Which probably is a nice time. Like you've mentioned this a couple of times, and I really want to spend some time talking about it. You talked about this shift for the creatives moving away from the dystopian to a utopian narrative.
Yes.
And
not utopian.
Oh, okay. To a positive narrative. Okay. Yeah. And even in my work, I do a lot of scenario work with clients and stuff like that. And I do lean slightly into the dystopian in those. I feel like there's almost like there's lessons to be learnt from those stories that are powerful lessons if you have the time to dissect them. And potentially the gap is if you don't take the time and effort to dissect them, you're not left with a lesson, you're just left with a bad feeling, So maybe that's part of it. But I also wonder about we talk about the power of social media algorithms that have had a tendency to promote content that is more negative than positive.
And now a word from our future sponsors.
Protests can be loud, cold, uncomfortable, and occasionally tear-gassy, which is why the Nanarchist Collective is here to help. We're a not-for-profit network of highly experienced grandmothers who believe every movement deserves better knitwear. Our range includes tear-gas-resistant scarves, super soft, no-scratch balaclavas in a variety of colors, camo cardigans for blending into very specific crowds, and, of course, our best-selling megaphone cozies. Because if you're going to chant for hours, your equipment should stay warm too. Every garment is handmade by guerrilla grandmothers quietly knitting their way toward a better world. The Nanarchist Collective, knitting loudly since 2026.
Why do you think it is that creatives, and even your own from your own work, do you feel like what has influenced you to either be more negative or more positive in the content you create?
Well, look, just on the most sort of basic level, news is negative. I mean, as a journalist, you kind of have to sort of focus on what went wrong. We didn't, in BRW, we did get a lot of opportunity to focus on what went right. We wrote about the Fast 100 and we wrote about success a lot. But people, given the choice between reading something positive and reading something negative, there's a very human thing that says we go negative, right? We're fascinated by the negative stories. And I am not saying that we start writing some, sort of Pollyanna sort of vision of the future. That would be like ignored. That would be I'm looking at what would actually be happening, what literally would be happening in the next 5 to 8 years for us to be actually turning the future into something that is survivable and thrivable. And so it is, I think, recognizing, I think the work that's been done, the stories of, technology collapse and what happens to the food supply chains when that happens. John Birmingham, fantastic, his books, the 0 Day. Tim Winton's book about the sort of like that searing sort of, world in which you have to live underground because it's too hot to get out. Like all of that stuff, it's really important. But we've sort of done it. And we need to, we need to start saying, so if that is the future, what are the stories that need to happen to change that future? And also, what are the stories that did happen to change it, to change our future? Like when I was, one of the issues, we were facing annihilation too when we were out in the 70s. There was the nuclear protest movement. We were under the belief, and I don't think we were far wrong, that, the sort of, the policy was mutual destruction. That was the policy. You fire at me and I fire at you and the world blows up. That was like as sophisticated as it got, and that was the end of the world. That was also the end. And that's why we have a no nukes in Australia. We fought for it. But yeah, so, what we have to do is recognize what has happened to change for us to be here now and what needs to happen for us to be somewhere different in the future. So we do have to sort of listen to the stories of sort of successful protest and unsuccessful protest. We were always protesting around Pine Gap because I lived in Central Australia for a couple of years and, still there. But we did kind of make sure that everybody in Australia knew it was there. So, we sort of, we made sure that people knew we had a target sitting in the centre of Australia should a war break out, They weren't going to just sit there and say, oh, well, but it's in Australia, so we won't bomb the American base in Australia. We'll just kind of leave that because they're nice Australians, We sort of made of those things. So what we have to do is start to sort of change. Say, okay, yes, that is the future. That is the future we are looking at. Not good. Very bad. What now are the stories we need to tell that gets us to a future that doesn't look like that? And you know what? We have all the answers. We have all the answers. We just don't yet have the political will to get there. So I'm talking about how do we sort of show, I reckon that one of the biggest, widest worldwide protest movements is recycling. It is a pointless act. Like it's a pointless act that everybody in the world recycles their stuff. Because what you need to do is make a change at the legislative level and make it so that you can't produce plastics or whatever. 2 years, you get it's done, it's over. But, in Norway, they said they recycle 95% of their waste. And admittedly, they do a fantastic job and they do dispose of it. But largely in Australia, it is a totally pointless act that everybody does. And I reckon that is protest. That is the future of protest. We have to understand that it's pointless, but we're doing it because we want to tell you that's what we want. We want it like that. Mm. We don't want this waste kind of piling up in, yeah.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack in just what you said. That last little bit I'll just make a comment on because I wrote a blog post, maybe it was only about a week or so ago. I was talking about like the hierarchy of controls in safety. And I was relating that to how we approach things like strategic thinking in organizations. And what we know from that hierarchy is there's better and worse interventions. And I'm hearing that in the recycling thing, right? So the lowest form of intervention is when we ask the end user or the person to make themselves safer. It's like, and I put the problem on you. And the highest type of intervention is, well, we just remove the source of the safety issue in the first place. And what you talk about is, yeah, well, we just literally remove plastic, we wouldn't have this issue at all. Yeah, I definitely hear that. I want to go back though. So one thing that's really come up for me in this episode and in your scenario is this is a very true example of what a positive story could look like, right? Like you're talking about the need for it and you are delivering it. And how it's impacted me in this conversation, I feel like I genuinely am missing out because I haven't been to protests and I haven't felt like that in the past. There has been like when you see the pictures of what seemed like relatively innocent people being beaten and arrested, you go like, well, could that be me? I feel like a relatively innocent person. If the stories that I read was about the community was built and the friendships that I made and the fun that we had while we were doing something that was really positive, it's like, wow, count me in. I'm up for a bit of fun on a Saturday, and I believe in the underlying cause, right? Like the two things can be both true. The other thing which I might have made a note about, which I felt was also this shift that we're seeing, because I'm trying to understand for us to have this outcome, what is going to lead to the 500,000 people or 1 million people around Australia on the streets, because that's ultimately what's needed. There's that 3.5% kind of rule, which says that any meaningful social movement has to have 3.5% of the population engaged in it before change happens.
Okay, great.
So there's some research done about this. So in Australia, that's just under 1 million people. It's about 1 million people that we need. And then I go like, well, how do we get to that point? And some of the things we kind of saw, around the social media stuff is that people are actually starting to switch off it. So peak social media, most places in the world, was around 2022. And there's been there's been about a 10 to 15% decline in social media use since then. And it's almost like, are we moving away? Like, first of all, we see social media as being less social. Like, I'm no longer finding my friends on it. My feed's just filled with kind of AI slop.
Yes.
And I still want the social part of it. What is going to be the thing that fills that hole for me if I'm not getting the updates from my friends and like in that environment? So I wonder, like, is all of this leaning towards something where what would it be for protest, either at a small scale, like the dialogue stuff you talked about earlier, or at a large scale, actually being part of our social fabric?
So I guess with the recycling example, I want to just sort of say the future of protest isn't just on the streets. Like we did a lot of stuff, we demanded better sandwiches. It's sort of, we did a lot of different kinds of things. And I didn't know that statistic about the 3%. That's wonderful to know. If that means that we need 1 million people in Australia, that really means we only need 10,000 on the streets. Because for every protest, there's usually 10 people who won't turn up.
No, you need 1 million people active, like 3.5% active.
Okay. All right. So, I think it's sort of, it's making it possible for there to be 1 million people. So maybe it's not possible to fill the streets with 500,000 people because of the logistical issues. So how do we show 1 million people? How do we do it? Like, we've just got to get our creative minds back on the task, I guess. So maybe it means that we have to, I think there's a protest on the 22nd of March that is happening in every city in Australia. So then you have, say, maybe you get 500,000 people by spreading it out all over Australia.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think that when you look at it like that, it's actually quite doable. Like if you kind of go, like we actually only need 300,000 in Sydney and 300,000 in Melbourne. Like I know it's still a lot of people, but like suddenly, and again, this has been that, when we talk about things like in the US, the rise of things like the No Kings movement, this is the number that they're aiming for, is can we get, we know that we can't try to put all those people in one place together is hard. And so with the No Kings movement, I think at the last one, there was something like, I don't know, I'm guessing at this, but it's something like there was 1,000 different No Kings rallies across the country. So some were just in a small town, right?
That's right.
But some were in a city, and maybe in large cities, there might have been 4 or 5 different separate protests because how do we get to this 3.5%? Now, the risk of it is if we see the number as being the outcome, then ultimately the number becomes meaningless. And even the author of this, her name, Erica, what was it? Sorry, there was a researcher that kind of came up with this fact. Her name was Erica Chenoweth, who did this in 2013. She's come out and said, like, put some caveats on it. It's not just 3.5%. It's 3.5% sustained and active in a movement. And I think that's kind of part of this. But yeah, like there are different ways we could think about this. One of the things I mean, weirdly, I know this sounds probably lazy and stuff, but I'm down on the Mornington Peninsula. Like, it's an hour and a half backwards and forwards each way to get to the protest, you know? I know there's a slack to best act like in that, but I also kind of go, well, what would it be that one of the protests was literally held on Main Street in Mornington?
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sort of, you know, then you would see who else in your community is concerned with the issues that you're concerned about.
Yeah.
And it'd be like, oh, hi. Oh, my God, I didn't realize. Yeah, great. Good to see you. And there's this whole other sort of side of it. So I think we have to, I guess what I'm sort of saying is it's kind of up to us to put the fun and the strategy back into it and to sort of reboot it. Look, I don't know, maybe you know, your generation was dragged along to too many protests by their boomer parents or something. So you kind of lost, but I think the 2 key things are that it doesn't stop. Like, we never get to the end thing. We have to kind of keep holding power to account all the time in various ways. But the other thing is, how do we do it in a way that is joyful and fun for us, that is smart, strategic, that is respectful, that is, you know, inclusive, all of those things that we've learned. You know, I learned about feminism when I went to school without walls at the age of 15. It was a big shock to the system. But, you know, even with that, when Monica Lewinsky, you know, that whole thing in 98, was it 98? Yeah. And the Star Report and all that stuff, you know, I was not, my feminism was not sophisticated enough to see what was happening to this young woman. Whereas now, we all are kind of, you know, the Me Too movement and all that sort of stuff. So these things are always like revolutionizing how we think. We've just got to remember how effective they are. You know, that, and, you know, I was thinking before about, like, Me Too was just 2 words. In Russia, where people are not allowed to sort of protest, they do something with the Swan Lake Ballet. Like, there's this whole backstory to Swan Lake that they use to indicate protest. In China, they would have blank pieces of paper that indicated protest. So even when, I mean, look at what happened recently and tragically, where the people in Iran went out and were shot on the streets. I mean, we are talking about people at a level of guts and sort of, you know, courage that we don't fortunately face if we stay vigilant. And, you know, because Argentina was, you know, a very middle class, you know, these places get overrun by, look at America, you know, a dictator can come from anywhere and take over. So.
Yeah. As I said, I feel like there's almost something to be said for, like, how do we maintain a sense of this active engagement all the time so that we don't have to deal with something far more significant some of the time? You know, like, yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. It's lost by inches. It's lost by inches. And, you know, they love it when we are feeling that we simply have no power. Power will come from the smallest little group. My friend down on Mornington Peninsula in Red Hill started a food sharing group. Food Share, it's called. And people just grow too much stuff in their own garden, bring it along and swap it over. It gives an incredible sense that you are among a community of people who share a concern with you, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, I picked up on that. Like a lot of my work is kind of associated with concepts of community and belonging. I do a lot of my kind of paid work is with local government. I'm the president of the local basketball club. I sit on the board of a library corporation.
Fantastic.
But one of the things I really took out of, I find that in a lot of those cases, there's a frustration, especially with, say, the basketball club, that community is quite, like it's not active. Like us trying to get volunteers is really hard. The people, and I know there's people out there that have an alignment in a shared belief around community and belonging, but you don't get to see it. And I do wonder about that as like you show up in this place at this time and you find the other people who are there like you, and how reassuring that would feel. I know we're kind of running out of time. Before we go, there was a couple of things I wanted to ask you. The first is, I know we've called this the future of protest, but it feels like that's not actually what this is about. Like it's almost more like it's about the future of agency or the future of response, like participation or something. Whatever that is, that thing, like what is it that do you believe for people listening that they should be aspiring to in this? And ultimately, what would be the something that they could do to move themselves closer to it? Is that, yeah.
I suppose if I look at my own trajectory, it's the future. It's community does it. Community does it, right? So I went to the School Without Walls and suddenly found this community of people who just like rocked my world. And, like I was a sort of middle class, private school, young woman, and who sort of hit this sort of alternative school and sort of had my political awakening, that led to a lot of, subsequent choices in my life. And one of them, I moved onto a commune when I was 17, and I kind of feel like I've come full circle. I now live in a Nightingale housing project. These are buildings built by a not-for-profit developer who prioritise living here. So our apartments are beautiful, livable places that mean that there's a strong sense of community in our apartment building. And it's all the way down. Like I'm in one building, there are 1,000 people down, along this section of Brunswick. It's really about community. And, when you invite your friends over to sort of, reinforce the sense of community amongst your friends, you don't sort of sit down and do an agenda. You give them food, you have some music going, kind of, like this is meant to be fun. So, just thinking more about, and this is making me think, too, like I'm thinking, now what can we do at the next, resident group meeting here that's fun? Like what can we do?
Inflatable suits.
Inflatable suits. Let's see the chair sort of sitting there in an inflatable suit and say, okay, we're getting too serious here. So it's like, it has been community all the way through. I went to the Docker River community and worked with the women down there, and community was so important. I was in the community arts movement in Melbourne. I was, even journalism is a sort of community of people trying to, do their thing. I had my business. It was all about sort of getting people to build their own communities around their books. It's just like, it's so important. It's everything. It gives us a belief in ourselves, in others. It's really tricky, you can't get people involved, and people like you always rub up against these kind of bizarre opinions, and like you have to keep, community's a bit more tricky than staying isolated in your own thing. People are really weird. Some people are super weird, and you have to sort of like kind of work a way around that and sort of like, okay, you don't, like I hate to talk to you about that, but we're talking here about this, and we're going to stay focused on this. So, I think it's community. Like, build yourself a community. If you've got communities, as you have just mentioned, and if I've just thought about, how can we make it more fun to be part of that community when we're not sort of rallying in, like, clawing for volunteers? We're like, can I join the basketball, club? Because I heard you had a really great party the other day when you were talking about the, next year's agenda. So,
Yeah,
I
well,
think
we
it's
have our awards event in about 2 weeks' time, and I think I shall go as a dinosaur potentially.
wonderful. It's
Yeah.
on. I can feel a protester being born.
I do think something like that. Again, I feel like when I'm asking for this advice for others, in some ways I'm asking for this advice for myself. And and I know that probably the simple answer is just go to one.
Yeah.
Like just find something that you have a relatively high sense of alignment with,
Yeah.
and just go to one. And then if you didn't, like, it's almost like eating Brussels sprouts or something, like if you try it and you
Yeah.
don't like it, you don't feel compelled to go to another one.
Sure.
But if you do it and you go, gosh, especially when you have it with a little bit of bacon and a lot of butter and salt, Brussels sprouts are delightful. And maybe it's like that, what is it? You might find that, so that was probably,
You make it fun.
yeah.
And you know what? There's so much stuff to do behind the scenes. There's people painting placards, and there's, banners, and there's, social media, and there's everybody you can, if I can't get out to certain protests, like that one in Sydney, my daughter was at that. It was very scary. So scary. I would have been, very nervous at that. It was a horrible moment. That was a very, re-energizing moment for me when the police sort of surrounded them in the pincer movement, But there's so much to do behind the scenes. Do it behind the scenes.
Tell me also, lastly, I get so much out of this, these kind of conversations. I genuinely do. I also kind of am acutely aware that I do get you to do most of the work. In terms of, writing the scenario and doing the research and everything. And I'm always kind of, I hope and I have enough evidence to suggest that when I ask guests to come on and do this, there's insights and stuff that they get out of it for themselves. Was there anything that you learned out of this, or that you're going to take away, or that's changed your own perspective about this idea, or maybe it's even just reinforced something that you already believed?
I think it's changed my life, Simon. I sort of feel like in forcing myself to think about the future, I sort of suddenly saw a lot more clearly a sort of path to that future, if I want that future and not the other future, which is not what I want, really. I don't like the way things are going. It's pretty scary and uncomfortable, and it can be really depressing. So I sort of felt like when I started the whole thing and it went towards that, I just thought, you know what, I don't want this, and I've never wanted that, and I've been fighting against it, for 50 years. So, it sort of rebooted or re-energized my activism, and I started a Substack called The Future of Protest. And, I want to sort of, and, I've written about my political awakening, and I've written about, my first attempt to write a novel, which was when I came back from Central Australia, and I was trying to explain what was going on out there was so hard. And so it's been fantastic for me. Like, I'm writing still, and I'm writing a novel, and it's just fed so much into that whole process. So it's, and of course, when I wrote about the School Without Walls on my Substack, all these people from the School Without Walls said, oh my God, and so I kind of reconnected with that community, and it's been great.
That is awesome. I'm so happy.
I'm so happy.
And, even what you said there's something you said earlier on about when you kind of decided that this was the topic, and then someone's invited you to a workshop, you're going, well, of course I have to go. Like, even that, there's something about the congruence that we need to create for ourselves. If this, as you said, if this is what I want, well, then I need to act in a way that's congruent with that. It means that I need to uplift my skills and I need to be more active. I think that's really beautiful that this is not a preachy thing, right? This is not you just going, hey, by the way, here's what everyone else needs to do. It's like, actually, no, here's what I need to do as a result of this, which I think is a beautiful, beautiful outcome from for you coming on my podcast.
Really good. So good. I sort of like, wow, okay, I should have thought of that before. And I have in the past sort of kind of projected what I wanted, but I guess there's a sense when you retire, it's like, oh, well, what do I do now? It was great to sort of think, okay, well, what do I do if I want that future? And I think it's all very integrated. Like part of the protest will be what I write in my book and what it'll be, I'll be, if it ever gets done, of course, everybody's writing a novel they never finish, but nobody cares if I do or don't. But I mean, it's all part of that and the Substack and
Yeah.
So,
And I really, what I am excited for out of this, I've always enjoyed your writing.
thank
I
you.
really enjoyed this scenario, and I really want to see, like, what has really triggered for me is how do I lean into that sense of positivity, even in my own scenario writing, because I've always felt that the slightly negative or slightly dystopian is where the lesson is. Whereas maybe it's also not though where the energy is. Like it might be that the energy is actually enabled by the positive perspective. And I'm not really sure what that means yet. I've got a client I'm doing some work with at the moment, which will lead to some scenarios like, how do I bring a bit of what Kath is saying into that? So thank you for this.
Fantastic. Lovely. Great to hear.
Well, that's going to be all we have time for, but it's been such a delight chatting with you, Kath. I'm so glad that you can come on and be part of the show.
Fantastic. Yeah, I've loved it. It's great to see you again too.
Yeah, it's been really good to see you. And I hope we get to catch up in real life, maybe at a protest somewhere shortly.
Yeah, let's get a protest going.
Yeah. All right. And thank you all for tuning in. That's the end of this episode, and we'll be back with another episode very, very soon. Till then.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. See you.
Well, that is all for this week's episode of The Future with Friends. If you've enjoyed the episode and you want to support the show, the number one thing you can do is share it with your friends. In fact, it would give me no greater joy than to think in a small way the conversations I'm having with my friends could be a positive influence on the conversations that you are having with yours. Other ways to support the show include going onto the podcasting platform of your choice and giving us a rating. Obviously, I would like it to be 5 stars, but you should ultimately do whatever feels right for you. And if you don't feel quite ready for that yet, if we're not at that point in our relationship, the other thing you can do is send me small gifts in the mail. I always enjoy receiving them. Well, that is all for this week. We will be back in another couple of weeks with the next episode. And so until then, my friends, I look forward to seeing you again.